Chapter 9, Plomo o Plata, the offer I couldn't refuse. General, I have a plane waiting for you right now, said William Walker, the State Department official assigned to get rid of me, one way or the other. You can pull together family members, friends, and anyone else you like, pack some things and leave for the airport. I am authorized by the president to give you $2 million immediately, along with a medal commemorating your years of fine service. The scene could not have been any more ridiculous. Walker and Michael Kozak had asked to meet me on March 18, 1988, 2 days after a coup attempt carried out in coordination with the CIA and the Southern Command. The timing was more than coincidental. The Americans were close to the coup leaders, Colonel Leonidas Macias, our chief of police, and Major Augusto Vialas, who had been working with U.S. Air Force intelligence. PDF intelligence efforts routed out the conspirators and all were arrested. When the coup failed, they went to an alternate plan, convinced me to leave on my own. The meeting was held at a Defense Forces house at Fort Clayton, one of the houses that had been turned over to Panamanian custody under provisions of the Canal Treaties. This had a nice symbolism for us. Also in attendance for the Panamanian side were several members of the general staff, Romulo Escobar Bethencourt, the veteran diplomat who had negotiated with the Americans during the Canal Treaties, and my American lawyers, Neil Sonnet, Raymond Takeif, and Steve Collin. Walker and Kozak, both veteran State Department officials, were accompanied by a third man named Steve Piesenik, who just sat there staring at me strangely. I was later tipped off that he was some sort of a psychiatrist whose job it was to psychoanalyze me by watching how many times I blinked and how many times I cleared my throat. The theory was that they could then figure out my weak points and set up psychological operations against me. I found out about this from one of our doctors, Carlos Garcia, who by chance knew this man and had asked him what was going on. Listen, Piesenik had said, the general is more straight than Kozak and Walker. They're the crazy ones. Walker repeated his offer. Okay, we have a plane waiting for you right here, gassed up and ready to go to Spain. You can leave, take all the people with you that you want. If you need money, we'll give you money. If you have friends you want to take with you, that's okay too. Anything you want. We'll even give you a medal for your service to the United States, if you like. Just leave the country. The Spanish government agrees and is awaiting your arrival. It's all been arranged. And that was it, bare-boned and on the table. No preamble, just, I am authorized by Schultz and President Reagan. You can read it right here in this document, he said, handing me a piece of paper that said that these men were their official negotiators and representatives. These men actually thought that I would go for it. They probably hadn't read the CIA biography of me, where they would have seen evidence that went against the resident belief that I was a self-serving sot who only cared about money. Noriega is intelligent, aggressive, ambitious, and ultra-nationalistic. He is a shrewd and escalating person, the biography says. Being a nationalist is not compatible with selling yourself and your country down the river for $2 million. I was intrigued. Had they actually brought $2 million in a suitcase? I was recalling how several years earlier they had used me as intermediary to pay the same amount of money to Gustavo Alvarez, the deposed Honduran military commander. In my case, they saw that I wasn't a willing victim. The coup attempt hadn't worked and I wouldn't go quietly. I had a fleeting thought that Walter and Kozak could probably be arrested under Panamanian law for attempted bribery, with the money being confiscated by the Attorney General's office. It was with great restraint that I didn't start to laugh as Walker talked on. When he finished, Kozak spoke, to give it the final touches. This is the sensible approach, he said, trying to take the hard edge off the conversation. Kozak had known us for years, having been a longtime friend of Romulo Escobar. I managed to contain myself and say almost nothing. I looked around the room. Thank you for coming, gentlemen. We have a lunch with President Solis Palma, I said. We can reconvene after that. It was true that we had a luncheon meeting planned with Solis Palma, but my words were a stalling tactic rather than anything else. We didn't even discuss the proposal during lunch, feeling that it was too absurd to warrant consideration. About 2 hours later, we went back to Fort Clayton and sat down with Walker and Kozak and the psychiatrist whose job it was to watch me blink. They looked at me expectantly. I told them what I could have told them straight off, that this was an unacceptable insult. You obviously have come here thinking that this is your colony and that you can push us around like chess pieces however you choose, I said. Panama is a sovereign nation and I am its military commander. I've always treated the United States equitably. You have no right to talk to me like this. I told them to get out of Panama. American foreign policy is probably always as cynical and simplistic as it was in the case of Panama. Capture the tyrant, restore freedom and democracy, stop drug dealers from killing our children. Simple slogans make it easier for the American government to win support from the public, who are mostly ignorant about what's really happening outside their own isolated spheres. There are two other slogans that the Americans respond to. One comes from The Godfather, making someone an offer they can't refuse. The other is almost the same, though it comes from the language of the drug traffickers. Plomo o Plata, lead or silver. Choose the money or we'll fill you full of lead. Both can be used with absolute precision to describe how the Americans decided to deal with me. They would either pay me to leave the country or they would have me killed. The money offer was a surprise. The plots to assassinate me were not. I knew they'd consider killing me in Torrijos during the Nixon administration. They saw these as viable alternatives. The Americans wanted to reassert their ability to control Panama and the Panama Canal and rid themselves of the defiant leader of an army they had created, but could no longer control. One plot by the Americans would have involved Colonel Eduardo Herrera Hassan, who had been our ambassador in Israel. Parallel to meeting with me, the Americans flew Herrera to Washington and asked him to raise a mercenary force on the Caribbean island of Antigua and infiltrate across the Costa Rican border into Panama. These men would stage an assault. If I happened to die as a result, would they have been sorry? Herrera ultimately declined. Years later, Del Valle told friends that he vetoed the plan when it was proposed as being too macabre and too violent. Innocent people would have been killed, and Del Valle told Washington that he would not support the operation. Once the United States made the decision to force me out of office, the only thing that could stop them was my resolve in the world of appearances. Since they had laws against overthrowing governments and killing foreign leaders, everything had to be secret. But I admit that the trouble they had brewed up was wearing me down. First, Ronald Reagan signed a series of secret orders that would lead to my ouster. They were known as Panama 1 through 5. Several of these directives involved mounting and funding the opposition against me. Panama 5 included repeated, unsuccessful attempts to mount military action against me, and failing that, a plan to have me killed. The directives may have been signed by Reagan, but the operation was the result of plotting by a committee of Panamanian exiles and State Department officials. Gabriel Luis Galindo, a one-time Torrijos and Defense Forces ally, was the Panamanian most responsible for plotting against me. Luis was motivated by revenge after I vetoed his claim to $1 million commission for participating in the sale of the government-owned Hotel Contadora to the Japanese Aoki Group. Luis took it personally and decided that he and the other members of the economic power elites would never be able to control the economic future of the country as long as the Panamanian Defense Forces continued to stand in the way of their business ventures. As long as I wouldn't interfere in his economic plans, Luis would surround me with attention and coordinate meetings for me with high-level American business and political leaders. Luis knew the workings of Washington better than any other Panamanian. The public relations lobby he created in the United States now became a powerful force against us, setting out to unite opposition to us in the State Department and the Congress. When he started working to overthrow me, so did the lobbying firm of Arnold and Porter, which once represented us. Luis and the chief propagandist at the law firm, William D. Rogers, a former Canal Treaty negotiator, used what they knew about Panama to their advantage, publicizing twisted information and attacking us on all fronts. They knew who our friends had been in the United States, and now influenced those friends so they would turn against us. Luis's most important ally in the Reagan administration was Elliott Abrams. It was Abrams who had failed so badly in Central America, working with Oliver North on trying to invade Nicaragua and destroy the Sandinistas. Abrams also had revenge in mind for my having rejected North's request for helping in their maniacal plans. Walker and Kozak worked for Abrams. My dismissal of Barletta played right into their hands. Barletta's vice president, Eric Del Valle, took over as president on September 28, 1985. Things went along smoothly for the first few months. Del Valle dropped the plan to link up with the International Monetary Fund. Labor relations improved, and the legislature and the entire public sector were put at ease that there would be no mass firings of civil servants. I always got along well with Del Valle, the heir of a sugar-growing empire. We had known each other for years, since he had been a good friend of my brother, Luis Carlos. I saw Del Valle as a practical, intelligent man. He was close to Gabriel Luis. Del Valle's daughter and Gabriel Luis's son had married. Nevertheless, the two men had a falling out, and I sided with Del Valle. Eventually, succumbing to family pressure and with the United States applying extreme economic threats, Del Valle moved to the Washington camp. The tide turned on February 4th, 1988, when the United States issued a drug indictment in Florida. The indictment named me, along with the Medellin and Cali cartels, in a massive plan to ship drugs to the United States. I soon realized that the Americans would use the indictment as part of a cynical little maneuver to encourage Del Valle to move against me. On February 25, 1988, 3 weeks after the indictment was issued, Del Valle was coaxed by Luis, Abrams and Company to issue a decree with no legal basis declaring that I was relieved of my duties and that Colonel Marcos Justin was to replace me as commander-in-chief. This was also humorous, bordering on the macabre. We had monitored Del Valle's preparations for the announcement for several days and even knew where he had taped the address that was to be broadcast that afternoon on nationwide television. We decided to take no action against the broadcast or Del Valle, preferring to gauge public reaction instead. As I sat in my office along with a number of associates waiting for the broadcast, I was reminded of the time almost 20 years earlier when Silvera and Sanjur tried to oust Torrijos and there were premature congratulations all around. Who will be congratulating Del Valle now? I wondered. His speech came on the air as planned. There is no other alternative but the use of the powers that the Constitution gives me to separate General Noriega from his high command and to hand over the leadership of the institution to the current Chief of Staff, Colonel Marco Justin, Del Valle announced. The response was complete and utter silence. No one took Del Valle seriously. Justin, who sat back in his chair, stared at Del Valle as if he were crazy. From Justin's house, Del Valle just drove on, stopping home long enough to pick up his bags. Without delay, he closeted himself at the U.S. Southern Command and prepared for exile in the United States. The Reagan administration now used all the means at its disposal to discredit me in the military. The drug charges were one method. I saw this indictment as part of U.S. pressure tactics and never took it seriously. I first refused to even consider legal counsel in the case, and then finally allowed my subordinates to choose lawyers, Raymond Takeif, Frank Rubino, Neil Sonnet, and Jack Fernandez, through contacts with Americans in the Canal Zone. And the Spadafora case was another tool, manipulated into a cause célèbre. Because of public relations, a single unsolved murder started to take on more importance in the United States than all the thousands upon thousands of murders taking place under U.S. auspices throughout Central America. The Spadafora card was played with the help of journalists who dealt unquestioningly with all the propaganda and listened to the rantings of Spadafora's brother, who found a life for himself in the notoriety surrounding his brother's death. To add to the pressure, the Abrams-Lewis team began weaving a system of news leaks about corruption. They planted information describing impossible charges of hidden wealth and a network of supposed colleagues who were controlling massive stocks of money. Corruption became the constant drumbeat of the Americans, as if Panama, under my control, had invented the concept in 3 short years, as if it would disappear as soon as they invaded my country. Corruption is endemic to Latin America. It didn't start with the Panamanian military, and it didn't end with its demise. If anything, without the control we supplied, corruption without an armed forces in Panama was worse than ever. The corruption charges were interesting in light of what happened after Del Valle moved into exile in Miami, purportedly establishing a government in exile. Taking his cues from Elliot Abrams, Del Valle, along with the Panamanian ambassador to Washington, Juan Sosa, now had power over millions of dollars in Panamanian funds deposited in U.S. banks. What they were trying to do with me was exactly what they had done so many times before in Guatemala, in Nicaragua, in Grenada. So it had been in Haiti with Baby Doc Duvalier. The United States orchestrated the formation of the Civic Crusade, essentially the work of the U.S. Embassy Chargé d'Affaires, John Maisto, the diplomat who was brought in from the Philippines to work the same magic he had produced against Marcos. This was ironic. Shortly after Marcos's overthrow, the Reagan administration had asked President Del Valle to grant asylum to Marcos. But the president decided against the U.S. request, largely because of the strong negative response from students, intellectuals, and others. I did not interfere in Del Valle's decision process on whether to give asylum to Marcos, even though doing so would have ingratiated us once again in the eyes of the Americans and could have diffused the coming plot against us. Maisto trained the Civic Crusade on how to organize street campaigns, how to burn tires and organize protest marches. He sent leaders of the Civic Crusade on a field trip to Manila, along with a priest designated by Archbishop Marcos McGrath, and gave them a briefing on how the destabilization campaign there had worked. Aurelio Barria, one of the Civic Crusade leaders, was singled out in particular by Maisto and received a briefing on the sequence of events that led to Marcos's fall. They started implementing similar actions one by one, a perfect copy. Once again, the American motto, if it works once, try it again, and the Kissinger refrain, to solve a problem, you have to create the problem, carried along U.S. policy. Despite all these efforts, the Civic Crusade never mustered the support of the vast majority of Panamanians, who came to refer to the crusade effort with derision as the protest of the Mercedes-Benz. We were not threatened by their actions in any major way, nor did we do anything other than maintain standard police controls of demonstrations to avoid public disorder. Of course, we were criticized for this as well, as if no police or national force had the right to maintain control. Many crusade leaders left the country in voluntary exile, fearful of a fight, but not because of any action by the Panamanian Defense Forces. The Americans piled on a series of increasingly severe economic sanctions designed to force us into bankruptcy. They expected that the pressure would make it impossible for us to meet our government and military payrolls. The most important sanctions were elimination of the quota for importing sugar and its derivatives, the freezing of assets of private banks in the National Bank of Panama and the U.S. Federal Reserve System, and creating an escrow account for receiving funds owed to Panama and the United States, including payments due Panama under the Canal Treaties. Eventually, the United States blocked outright all our exports to the United States, accounting for 2/3 of all our export revenue. It also restricted exports to Panama and called on its trading partners to do likewise. As the sanctions continued, the United States accomplished what it wanted. It forced a massive recession, unemployment, lack of market for agricultural goods, and scarcity of manufactured products. It created an unjustified crisis on a massive scale. We organized to resist the economic pressure, but at a terrible cost. The American policy was designed to turn Panama from a thriving, healthy country into an impoverished shell. Prices soared, people lost their jobs, all because of a cynical policy by a small group of men out for revenge. Our response was to publicize what the Americans were doing to us and find ways to become self-sufficient. It was difficult, but we managed to pay our state payroll, never missing a day. We were even able to pay year-end bonuses. We managed to stay liquid and to meet government debts, and we also were able to maintain key public services for healthcare, the poor, and highway maintenance. We organized subsidized care packages for the poorest communities, sent out military civic action teams to enhance agricultural production, and took measures to eliminate black marketeering at all levels. On the international front, we went for help where it was available. The Americans used all means at their disposal to discourage their European allies in Japan from doing business with us. So we established relations with the Palestine Liberation Organization, North Korea, and the Soviet Union, looking for diplomatic and economic support. These were all ways of seeking economic and political independence. Panama had been a country whose foreign relations were under the umbrella of the Department of State. Set free from that obligation, we made deals, much to the chagrin of the United States. We signed an agreement with Moscow, for the first time giving Aeroflot Airlines landing rights in Panama. We also signed a fishing agreement with the Russians, which gave their maritime fleets rights to operate in our waters, increasing their business in the region. Of course, to the Americans, this meant that the Russians would be able to spy on them more easily, since some Soviet fishing boats also carried electronic surveillance. The Americans passed along their dissatisfaction through diplomatic channels, but they were hardly in a position to make demands. We didn't care what the United States thought. The sanctions were a cynical exercise orchestrated in much the same way that the United States imposed sanctions on Cuba and Haiti. The result was unjustified interference in our economic affairs. The effects were felt in reverse proportion to how wealthy someone was. The rich businessmen of Panama City may have suffered economic problems, but it was the poor people of San Miguelito who had less to eat. Was this fair, or was it another type of invasion by the United States, an invasion of our right to economic independence? Considering our resources, we were doing a pretty good job of fending off the American Goliath. There was, of course, rising popular discontent, but most of that was caused by the economic hardships provoked by the Americans. It was the same cynical approach used by the Americans with Fidel Castro in Cuba. Willfully destroy the economy and then blame the leadership for an inability to maintain proper standards of living. Despite everything thrown at us, there were jobs and food for Panamanians throughout the crisis. The secret policy directives focused on a number of fronts. The sanctions and political action were followed by attempts to subvert the military. And in each case of military subversion, the U.S. tried to use military pressure as a lever in their attempt to negotiate with me to leave power. The visit by Walker, Kozak, and the psychiatrist was not the first attempt at negotiations to get me to leave office. At the same time that the Abrams-Lewis team was working on coup plots and veiled assassinations, they orchestrated a visit by Carlos Andrés Pérez, the former president of Venezuela. Carlos Andrés had been Panama's ally during the Canal Treaty negotiations. After having been out of office for 10 years, he was now campaigning for re-election in 1988 and sought to enhance his image at home by focusing on his value as a Venezuelan statesman in the international arena. Carlos Andrés' effort seemed like a welcome surprise, since he had been our friend and ally during the Panama Canal Treaty negotiations. But my friends at the CIA, with whom I maintained close contacts throughout the crisis, told me that the Venezuelan statesman was now fronting for the Americans. "Leave everything to me," Carlos Andrés told Washington. "I can deal with Noriega." Carlos Andrés flew to Rio Hato Air Base on March 7, 1988, accompanied by former Colombian President Alfonso López Michelsen and Carlos Pérez Rosagare, a close Colombian friend to the Venezuelan president. We met at a thatched-roof party hut at Rio Hato. Carlos Andrés quickly started singing the same tune being sung by Walker and Kozak. "It is high time for the military to withdraw from politics," he said. By our final meeting on March 29th, it was obvious that Carlos Andrés was under pressure to deliver his promise to the United States, that he could take care of Noriega. "Retire," he said. "Hold free elections without the PRD or the military. Archbishop Marcos McGrath, the leader of the Panamanian Catholic Church, would serve as guarantor of a transition period to civilian control." Perhaps through his own ignorance, Carlos Andrés did not know that McGrath was far from neutral. The meeting was inconclusive, but Carlos Andrés was not to be deterred. He just went home and announced that I had capitulated and would retire, thanks to his mediation. I then rejected his remarks as the lies they were. Carlos Andrés told his American benefactors that I had reneged on his agreement, that I was stubborn beyond all bounds, and that perhaps an invasion was the only way to get me out of the picture. I was reminded of what Torrijos had said. "All Venezuelans have dreams of being Simón Bolívar," Omar said. How true was Torrijos' analysis? It was evident that this man wanted to make his historical mark. There he was, bragging about how he was talking to the Americans at the highest level, how he would take care of everything. There were perhaps 3 separate meetings. Each time, Carlos Andrés flew to Panama, then went back to report on progress to his friends in Washington. And in the end, what a great inheritor of the mantle of Simón Bolívar, the great liberator, who sought to unite Latin America to free it from the yoke of colonialism. Carlos Andrés Pérez, oozing with his own ego-inspired problems, promoted illegal intervention in a fellow Latin country by the greatest colonial power of them all. Carlos Andrés became an accomplice in the U.S. operation to wipe out the Panamanian military and kill hundreds of Panamanian civilians. But the Americans persisted. In April, Kozak came back. Walker and the psychiatrist were conspicuously absent. The first thing Kozak did was issue a mild apology for Walker's behavior. Seated before the Panamanian delegation, he said that he had felt bad about the previous visit. Walker, he said, had not been very diplomatic, and it had indeed been an insult. And then he launched into the same proposals, all aimed at having me retire from the military and leave Panama. Kozak was more respectful, playing the good cop to Walter's bad cop, but the proposal was essentially the same. I would agree to leave Panama for 6 months, retire from the armed forces, and not participate in any way in presidential elections scheduled for May 1989. This time, I admit, I was ready to accept the possibility of a deal. I was growing weary of all the pressure. I knew I had strong opponents with voices that spoke loudly in Washington, but the campesinos and the unions were supporting me. It was not my popularity that was at stake, nor my physical health, nor stress or anything like that. There was no personal problem. I was simply weighing the balance of the country in the international scheme of things. The screws were being tightened on us to an extent that hadn't taken place in any other country, not even in Cuba. I thought perhaps I could negotiate with Kozak to reach some sort of détente and an end to the craziness. If I was the one person who could bring about the change, perhaps it wouldn't be so bad to retire. Kozak proposed that we continue to negotiate under certain conditions: complete confidentiality during the talks and written proof that the United States would drop the charges against me and stop trying to have me arrested or killed. We asked to split up the political and legal aspects of their proposals. Our American defense attorneys, Takef, Rubino, and Fernandez, talked with U.S. Justice Department negotiators about the legal aspects of the case. Romulo Escobar and members of the military command negotiated with Kozak and his aides about the substance of what they had to propose. The meetings lasted for several weeks. Finally, on May 25th, we reached a deadline imposed by the United States. Reagan was on his way to a summit meeting with Mikhail Gorbachev and wanted to be able to announce an agreement that would end the Panama crisis. What he wanted to do was answer Gorbachev's call for perestroika with an example of how the United States was now working to make peace throughout Latin America. Now that Noriega is leaving Panama on such and such a date, only Cuba is still outside the list of hostile governments. That was their plan. The only thing was, I didn't know about it. So they went ahead with their agenda and worked on it within their own time schedule, not within mine. On the legal side, everything was set. They agreed that U.S. Attorney General Edwin Meese would petition the federal court for dismissal of the baseless charges against me, that they would prove that the dismissal was granted and that there would never again be any other charges of any kind. But the political issue was not resolved. I had misgivings and doubted that my departure from the political scene would really solve anything. Many friends and military colleagues agreed with me. I was free to decide for myself, but the general staff in particular argued that Panama would face instability if I left. There would be a perception that Panama was again capitulating to American imperialism. This, in turn, would bring political and economic turmoil, and the Americans would impose a new government with their own chosen members of the oligarchy, a change that they alone would say had taken place democratically. The armed forces would be under the control of this new government, if they existed at all. I wavered, still fed up and sick of the whole thing, and the Americans were pressuring me at the deadline. Reagan had already left for Russia, and Schultz had held back, waiting for word from me. "Come on, let's go," Kozak said. "President Reagan is waiting for you to sign." I could take little solace from the fact that at that moment my decision held up the weighty matters of a superpower summit. That day, the Defense Forces General Staff met at our offices on Calle 50 and read Kozak's proposal. They rejected it outright, giving me their full support and advising me not to accept. I thought about it and finally went back to the Americans. I entered the room where they had gathered and looked around at everyone. "No," I told Kozak. "I won't do it." I cannot regret my decision, and I have no remorse for my actions. But I am deeply pained by all that has happened. My only consolation is that at least I did not hand over the country. The end result was the same. The Americans imposed a government and disbanded the armed forces. But it took an act of war to do it, blasting through the neutrality treaty and all bounds of civilized behavior. No one rolled over for them, least of all, me. The Americans were livid. They regrouped and stepped up all manner of provocations and interference in our affairs. Our posture was to avoid confrontation by all possible means. When we didn't take the bait, they became more and more blatant in their actions, conducting activity that they knew was in open violation of the Torrijos-Carter treaties. They systematically began to abrogate every provision of the Panama Canal treaties. They sent illegal air, land, and sea patrols into our territory, all of which are specifically banned in the canal treaties. They staged maneuvers at will and buzzed the ground close to population centers. The area close to the U.S. bases suffered all sorts of indignities. In one incident, a U.S. helicopter that was flying too low crashed into a poor area of town, destroying houses. Every time a plane flew overhead, it shook the straw off the roofs of peasant huts. Cattle scattered in fear. And there were chronic traffic accidents caused by unauthorized American convoys traversing Panamanian territory without regard to civilians. The Americans, under treaty regulations, should have asked permission when they took out convoys on the road, but they rarely did. To raise tensions, they sent U.S. soldiers walking around Panama dressed in their uniforms, a clear treaty violation. It sounds like a small detail, but the presence of uniformed U.S. soldiers in Panama City streets was more than illegal. The Americans used it as a symbol of their impunity and our powerlessness when they decided to exercise their will. When we protested, there was no response. We understood the process. We knew their modus operandi. These were scripted provocations, and we warned our people not to be drawn into conflict. What other country would be subject to such indignities? We were at the will of an occupying army. Small wonder that I would later be confused by the military activity on December 20th, 1989. We were facing a permanent U.S. invasion. Despite all of this, some U.S. diplomats in the intelligence community in particular disagreed with Washington's policies. Ambassador Arthur Davis maintained cordial contacts with us until the very end. This was in marked contrast to the behavior of John Maisto, his deputy, who was the official designated to plan and carry out the civil disobedience campaign against the government. Maisto's idea of diplomacy was to ban all official contact between embassy staff and Panamanian military. Then, content with his isolation and ignorance, he would hold policy meetings at the U.S. Embassy, in which he berated me for being irrational and incapable of dialogue. Davis's genteel manner was of little value. Policy was being controlled out of Washington. Davis had so little power that he was unable to control even his daughter, Susan, who had become active in the campaign of the Civic Crusade. She staged protests, banged pots and pans, and became the darling of the international news media by passing along half-truths and gossip designed to sabotage the Panamanian government. Lines of respectful communication were closed, with very few exceptions. At one point, Senator Christopher Dodd came to see us, seeking the release of some prisoners. American visitors, whether Dodd or negotiators from the State Department, always took the same line. There was one solution: my resignation, my departure from Panama. That was what they were all trying to sell.